Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending the development of animal welfare laws in the European Union, success, failure, or simply the wrong DNA. Our speakers are Dr. Simon Broman. He is a former senior lecturer in animal law and continues to write on the subject. And he designed and taught the longest running animal law module in UK universities for 27 years. Dr. Rachel Dunn heads the clinical and employability activities at Leeds Law School, Leeds Beckett University, where she established its first animal law module. They're both widely published, and they are the co-authors of Animal Law, Challenges and Themes, which was published this year by 5M Publishing. The link should be in the email I sent you, but if you need it, please email me and I'll be happy to send it over. I will now turn it over to our speakers.
Thanks very much, Brett, and welcome everybody to this talk. And thank you to Brett for inviting us. We've been looking forward to it for weeks, actually. And certainly for me, it's rare that I get a chance to talk about this sort of thing these days, having retired to the long grass as you do. But anyway, we when Rachel and I were having a look at this, we looked at the whole European Union successes and failures in all sorts of areas, and there's obviously a lot of legislation, lots of law, and when you try and compare it with domestic legislation, you're talking an even bigger pool of law. So we've restricted the talk. So I'll just very briefly just tell you what we're going to talk about. I'm just going to set a little bit of a historical context in a moment, just to tell you how the laws in the EU and the UK have developed over time. That's another lecture in itself, so it'll be quite brief. And then we're going to look at the idea of there being a different development line in the EU and the UK and any domestic legislation through those three areas: animal experimentation, Brexit, and sentience, and the live transport of animals in the EU, all quite live. We could have equally done things like domestic animals. We could have looked at other areas of agriculture, not just transport. There's a lot of law out there, but obviously a time is limited. But later on, we're quite open to questions on that kind of area. If people have questions about areas outside this, that'd be absolutely fine. So we're going to go through those three areas and then have a look at the conclusions and where we think the law is heading next for the EU and the UK. Now that the UK has Brexited as such. I hope you're all familiar with that term. I've noticed some names here, people in the UK, so they'll know what it's all about. But for those of you in the US or elsewhere, it's when the UK left the EU, it was termed Brexit, British exit from the EU, and it's stuck around ever since, like a noose. It's been a term that we've got sick of, really, but it's there for the duration, I'm afraid. So we'll have a look at the conclusions and then the Q&A at the end. So we'll be talking for, I don't know, somewhere between 25 and 30 minutes. So I'll start us off with a little on the historical development. And it may seem strange there. There's a picture immediately of something from World War II, because this had a big impact on the development of the EU. Obviously, the EU was formed post-war, but Europe had been in turmoil twice, up to 1918 and then again in 1939 to 45. And the EU is born out of that. It was felt that in order to tie the nations of Europe together more securely and to avoid the waste, the carnage that had gone on, that the best way, one of the ways to do this would be to tie the countries together economically. It was a good idea, really, because in many ways there's a lot of evidence that from Germany itself through the 1920s and 30s that it was actually poverty that drove the politics. So the thinking was that if they could tie these countries together in some way, then they would avoid war again. So that kind of post-war settlement, even though it was a few years after the war, it began with coal, iron and steel in 1951. I'll come to that in a moment, but then went on to become a much bigger bigger thing altogether. And that's this map of Europe you can see down to the bottom right tells you the countries that were originally in dark blue. You've got the original countries. I won't go through them. There's only 6 there. In 1957, they formed the first block, and then by 2017, obviously, it expanded to incorporate all the countries in light blue. Now, sadly, we have left. There are also a couple of fringe countries that have different arrangements with the EU, quite close, like Norway, which is there, not coloured at all, but it's very close to the EU. So this sort of creates the DNA, and in our title, part of the or one of the main themes of this is the DNA of the EU rights to take animal welfare forward. But the EU's original DNA was all about trade. It was all about keeping Europe stable. Animal welfare didn't even figure. That came much later. But now we've got a lot of EU protections. That's point there. Just many protections for the animals in agriculture, science, and the wild, and they've grown really out of an approach to the economics of those situations rather than because of an outright concern for animal welfare. That's come much more recently, and there may be something in the water which is going to change that. So those are the stepping stones in the EU, the European Coal and Steel Community, then the Treaty of Rome itself, which is the first kind of, which looks very much like the EU we have now, establishing that community of economically tied nations. And then it's been altered and adjusted in many treaties since Maastricht, Amsterdam, Nice, and the Lisbon Treaty. There'll probably be more. Maastricht and Amsterdam are interesting for us because they are the first times that the EU actually directly put itself in a position to regulate what was happening to animals, and it looked like it wasn't necessarily for economic reasons. It looked much more like that they were actually giving regard to the actual welfare of animals rather than trying to regulate a level playing field economically, because before that was the driving force almost entirely. So the 1992 Maastricht Treaty mentions give regard to the welfare requirements of animals. It's not a strong protection of welfare at all, but it is actually a mention, and it was put in there. So I think animal welfare organisations at the time were delighted in that. It got stronger in 1997 when the infamous Protocol of the Amsterdam Treaty was put into force, recognising sentience. But more of that in a moment, because we're going to go through sentience. And since then, we've had numerous directives, and before those two treaties, we've had numerous directives which show that overall, over its time, from initially 1951, 57, right the way through these treaties to currently, the EU has definitely changed in one way, shape, or form. But I'll come to that more in a moment. Therefore, in the EU, they are given protection, but it would still have to be said that the main reason for that is that they are subjects of trade. And the idea is that the EU wants to protect that trade, make it level everywhere, and therefore they do so by protecting welfare the same for each country. Right, I'll now hand over to, no, won't, just for me as well, too, isn't it? To be the last one, sorry. The UK. I'll go through this quite quickly. If you want more on this, we could provide more on this. But basically, the UK is considered to be very much a leading country in welfare legislation. Supposedly, the first legislation there in 1822. You can see there that with 3 or 4 attempts to get this through, there's one missing there actually. It was 1800, 1802, 1809. There was another one just before 1821 where Richard Martin, who's there pictured on the right, he actually introduced another one to protect horses, and it was laughed out by I think one of his main opponents, which was William Wyndham, who was Secretary for War. And he said, if it's going to be horses protected, it's going to be asses next. And this brought the house down. And so of the time, it failed. And that was the kind of ridicule approach that the as the Parliament had at that time. You can see the votes were quite close. Richard Martin, extraordinary chap, and that picture down to the right is, in fact, he's quite famous for having. This is one of the things he's famous for. He took a donkey into court in one of the first cases, and the second thing he was quite well known for is that he prosecuted people, undertook the prosecutions himself under this act for the improper treatment of horses and cattle, and then would pay their fines, the people who've been prosecuted, because he just wanted to make the point. He was considered himself to be a man of the people, and didn't want to see them in poverty. He wanted to make the point about animal protection. Really interesting chap. MP for Galway, which, as some of you may know, is in Ireland, but when Ireland was part of the UK, obviously, so that's why he was in Parliament at the time. So that's how UK legislation was born. It's been all sorts of acts ever since, many that we could go through, numerous protections of animals, definitely ahead of most countries in the world. But it was, in fact, the US, Massachusetts, 1641. I think some of the original people who landed in Massachusetts actually had a body of laws which contained some protection of animals. So that wasn't the first necessarily, but it was one of the first in parliamentary terms. Right, Rachel.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. I think we like to claim it's the first, but it's a bit loose sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so moving on to animal experimentation as an example of our relationship with the EU when we're thinking about animal protection laws. So the UK has actually had quite a long history in terms of trying to regulate animals using scientific procedures. So our first act that related to this was the Cruelty to Animals Act in 1876. And before this, there was no regulation. And there'd been a big rise in the UK at the time of animal experiments, often in a scientific way, kind of, actual research way, but also in terms of the Victorians quite liked it for parlour entertainment. So people would come in and do experiments on live animals as demonstrations for entertainment for often quite wealthy people. So it was decided that actually we need to regulate this. And this is when we get the 1876 Act, which is the first known legislation in the world, as far as we're aware, to regulate the use of live animals in research. It's progressed since then, and the latest act that we have is the Animal Scientific Procedures Act of 1986. This was updated in 2013, and I'll go on to talk about why that was updated. But to be honest, not a lot of big changes were made in 2013. So our experimentation legislation is actually, I feel, getting a little bit old now. But basically, the main provision of the Act, with kind of a welfare hat on, is that animal experimentations have to be licensed. So that was the kind of main reason behind ASPA coming in, that, we're looking at the licensing of these experiments and making sure that people are doing what they say they're doing, that these experiments are deemed to be needed or necessary for a public benefit in some way or to advance scientific knowledge. And that if people are going beyond what has been granted to them in their license, there is some repercussions for that. But there's been quite a lot of issues with the UK regarding experimentation over the years. So there's a lack of prosecutions. There's been no prosecutions that we're aware of under the 1986 Act. It's all very secretive. So that's something that academics and NGOs and charities pick up on quite a lot, that it's just so secret, even if we know that there is infringements to licenses that are granted, but seemingly nothing happens as a result of that. Even though people are required to publish post-technical reports to say what has happened, a lot of the time these are very kind of redacted. They often don't say what went wrong, or if some of the times they don't even mention welfare issues with the animals. So we again can't really get a lot of information from them. And they are also protected from freedom of information laws as well in the UK. So even trying to get that further information has been really difficult. and an insufficient use of the 3Rs. So the 3Rs are a way to help find alternatives to animal testing. So we're looking at reduction, refinement, and replacement. That has been built into the legislation from EU legislation, but unfortunately, it doesn't appear to be working, which we'll go on to look at. Simon, if you can click through. So with the EU legislation, they introduced a directive in 2010. And this replaced, like I said, and updated a previous directive and our law at the time as well. And it appeared to be very much modelled on our legislation, ASPA. So it didn't actually really change our domestic law that much. It introduced some elements, but really we kind of already had it all there anyway. It was positive in some ways, though, because there was some member states who had really quite poor animal experimentation regulation laws. So it did bring them up to a higher standard across the EU, which was obviously very good. It had banned experiments on great apes. Now, we'd effectively already done this in the UK because we'd stopped giving any licenses for experiments on great apes. They required that publication of non-technical summaries so the public could see what was going on. Data sharing between member states, which was actually, it's quite an important one I'll come back to. That promotion of the 3Rs and a harm benefit assessment has to be carried out before experiments can go forward. There's lots of other things it brought in. I've just kind of picked some of the main ones, but we already had most of these elements in our legislation anyway. What was interesting and quite unique to this directive is under Article 2. So, under Article 2, member states were prohibited. So, once they've brought in their legislation to implement this directive, they then can't go above the protection that's granted in that directive in their domestic legislation. Now, I'm not aware of any other EU directive that has done this, to be honest. It seems to be quite unique to this directive. So after they've transposed this directive, that's it, you're cut off. So you have to, your max is what the EU directive has said. Any member states who had greater protective measures prior to this directive coming in, like the UK, could retain them as long as they were in force before November 2012. And some member states did do that. But it is quite strange that it seems to be controlling later legislation rather than just the directive that has to be transposed. If you can click, Simon. Thank you. So has it had a positive impact in animals used in science? Maybe, but not really in terms of if we think about animals used in terms of numbers. So in 2017, there was 9.39 million animals that were used in the EU. The UK were using the highest number of animals at this point, and we were still included in these statistics at this time, followed by Germany and France. And what was interesting is that some countries have decreased their numbers, but some countries have increased their numbers. So it appears to be that some countries now are engaging more with scientific procedures and therefore using more animals. So it doesn't seem to have had a drastic impact on the numbers of animals that are being used in procedures across Europe. In the UK, in 2024, we had 2.6 million procedures, which is still quite a lot of procedures that are being carried out on live animals. A reason for this rise could be due to a loss of the database called REACH, which is a data sharing database in the EU, where you are required to put in your results from animal testing. And that means that if anyone else needs to test certain chemicals, they can go onto that database and go, okay, it's already been done. We know what those results are. But we lost access to that upon Brexit. So we've had to kind of make our own database since then, but it means that we've had to replicate some studies because we lost access to that data. But the EU seems to have increased overall with 9.2 million procedures carried out across the EU, and that now obviously excludes the UK. So there has been opportunities that have arisen from Brexit that could allow the UK to become a world leader again in terms of animals used in experiments, but we haven't really chosen to take them up. In fact, since Brexit, there's been no talk at all about animal experimentation when the government published their action plan for animal welfare, which covered a lot of different groups of animals. animals and experimentation were barely mentioned, and it was basically just, we'll keep up the standards, and that was it. So really, there is opportunity since we've left the EU, but we haven't really taken them up. Simon? Okay.
The second example, I was muted for some strange reason. The second example is Brexit and sentience, and particularly the protection of sentience. Well, it can only be said that the UK government got itself into a right pickle. When we left the EU, the idea was that we would just en masse pass all EU legislation to UK law, so, and then we'd pick and choose what we wanted from then on. But during the debate, it was decided that the protocol from the 1997 Amsterdam Treaty should not be retained, which recognises animals being sentient and that government ministers should take it into account. So we didn't have anything like that in UK law, but the government, in its wisdom, decided it should not be part of UK law going forward, because the argument went that we had all these things were protected in UK law anyway. You know, that there was protection for farm animals. We had the 1986 Scientific Procedures Act and various other legislation which already protected sentience. So we didn't need anything like this EU protection. So they whipped their MPs to vote it down, and there was a right stink. It went on for several months afterwards. It was in November 2017 it started, and this went on for about 5 months. And they were really on the back foot. And you can see there's a Guardian article there. You know, the Commons vote against transferring EU protocol on animal sentience into UK law was widely misconstrued, insist MPs. They all got a lot of traffic in their inbox because it was alleged, probably wrongly generally, but there was something in it that they denied the sentience of animals. It just didn't look good. So massive backtracking. They came up with another bill about 5 months later, which was an insult to all animals, including humans. It was thrown out. So there was a committee inquiry on it, basically, in the backbenches as it went through Parliament, and it was a shifty little piece of legislation that wouldn't work anywhere. So that didn't work. So we had the odd situation that the UK claiming it was covering sentience, but having nothing defining sentience, and the EU having something in 1997. Move this on, and we get to saying, well, what is sentience? Now, there's lots of definitions of this. Here's one. You can sort of browse it as I'm talking. I won't talk us through that, but basically it's along the lines of sentience not only includes the basic needs of an animal, which have been covered in the UK from about 1965 and before, but particularly recognised and named warmth, hunger, freedom from fear, etc. in the Bramble Committee report regarding agricultural animals in 1965. And that's part of sentience, but obviously we know that animals are sentient in much more ways than that, in terms of, you know, wanting to be together, the sense of community for some animals. You know, there's all sorts of things that we now recognise and are able to put into words what animals are like and how they perceive the world. And that's obvious to some of us, but for legislators, it hasn't been as obvious. So that is one decent definition of sentience there. There are some other good ones, but I'm sure you know some. Maybe you can talk about that afterwards. I'm not sure. In EU law, this was Article 13, and the main thing, this is what we voted out, basically, in formulating and implementing the union's agriculture and all the other policies. In yellow there, paid full regard to the welfare requirements of animals whilst respecting the legislative and administrative provisions and customs of the member states. In a way, that gives with one hand, says you should take account of sentient beings in creating all those laws, but it takes it away while respecting provisions and customs. I mean, that could be anything. So it was a bit of an open door policy, but it was considered to be a pretty landmark achievement from the animal welfare community, in that sentience was now sort of recognised in a piece of legislation. Whether it's worked or not, I suppose, is the subject of this talk, and we'll discuss that as we go through the summary. But there's what we're trying to protect. if you look at that in UK law and that definition of sentience, then it is everywhere. It is covered. The government, to a certain extent, was right that there are a lot of acts, such as the Animal Welfare Act of 2006 and the one Rachel just talked about, the related to animals used in experimentation, which do define elements of sentience and protect them in some way. But it is very much a kind of given by human beings in our terms, and I think this is where Blattner, that fourth point down there, she bases this all on cognitive biases in society. That basically, as we've developed this legislation in the UK and elsewhere, you can argue that we've done it on the basis of what we think or the species we like to protect, not on the basis of sentience at all. And as you look through legislation, well-known one is dogs and pigs, considered to be of very similar mental standing, and you know they are quite similar in some way, but obviously one is given a lot more protection because of our relationship with it, i.e. Dogs than pigs. So there is a fault line that runs through UK sentience legislation, you could say. But what we did get was that came out of the Brexit war is this new development. This is quite a step. 2022, there's a new sentience committee, animal sentience committee, which was what came out of the discussions, which went on for a few years, as you can see, about 4 years, to come to the conclusion that we needed a separate body to deal with this. And they came up with the Animal Sentience Committee, which has now been sitting, as you see, for 3 years, looking at vertebrates. Cephalopod, mollusks, the octopus, squid, cuttlefish have been included, but there's obviously a lot of other creatures that are not included in that. So its scope is limited, but they are given quite a lot of liberty to write reports on anything they think. And the word may is used, appears in the legislation in terms of how legislation is going to affect animals. And is it working? Well, 7 reports so far, 5 with government responses. The government is tasked with responding within 3 months, and I think they've been out of time, from what I can make out. And they're certainly waiting on 2 more responses. But they do seem to be leading to a better consideration of some animals of animal sentience. Whether it works over time, we don't know. And there's also other bodies, for example, those committees that advise government ministers on the operation of agricultural protection of animals. We don't know where that's going to lie in terms of how those conflict. But recently, there's a lot of discussion in the UK about more planning, and they've raised concerns over the EU government approach to that because they haven't even considered how it's going to affect wildlife. So that's you know, they do seem to be stirring things up a little bit. So in the EU, strangely, just to finish this part, having had the legislation or mentioned in a treaty anyway in 1997, they don't have any equivalent committee. There is criticism of them in terms of the way they are changing their animal welfare laws, and this is probably part of it. We'll come to that in the summary. So as compared to the UK, they seem to be moving on the sentience issue slower now than the UK, which is, I suppose, a Brexit benefit, those people would argue. But we probably were ahead beforehand anyway. So back to you, Rachel.
Thank you. And then just the last example is live transport of animals. So as most of you will probably know, that most live animals are transported mainly for fattening and slaughter at their destination jurisdiction. And there's been massive welfare issues that have been exposed of this over many years in terms of food and water deprivation, thermal extremes, so being way too hot or way too cold during transport, physical injuries, motion sickness, mixing with unfamiliar animals, which can also then have an impact on humans if there's any disease spreading. So there's lots of issues that we have with live transports of animals, and in the UK we were a big exporter of live animals. So in the 1990s we had over 1 million animals being exported live annually. And this was a big industry for us, particularly with 66% of our animals going to the EU in 2014 to 18. So the EU really was a big trade hub for us for live animals. This obviously plummeted to just over 6,000 in 2018 because of Brexit, and we were really struggled to get some of those trade deals set up. So actually, that was a big win for some of the animals that were going to be transported. And farmers and welfare groups since then, though, have been raising concerns with the trade deals because it's led to imports of animals from countries with lower welfare standards in the UK. Farmers are saying that this can put them out of business and things like that. So there's ongoing issues with farming in the UK since Brexit. But one of the issues, Simon, if you can just click on to the next slide. It hasn't worked, Simon. Sorry. Thank you. Was that we were quite restricted by the EU in terms of what we could do around live exports and imports of animals. So I'm not going to go through all of this, and we have said to Brett that he can share the slides after the talk, but we did have EU regulation around transported animals, and this was returned by the UK after Brexit. So it was very general. Animals can't be transported in a way that causes injury or undue suffering. They have to be fit. um People handling them have to have adequate training. For long journeys, there was lots of rules around brakes and checks and things like that. Now, it was quite under enforced, and one of the issues is that when you get animals going from the UK to the other side of Europe, they're going through very different countries, and the standards of enforcement in those countries could differ a lot as well. So really, the regulation is good to have on paper, but in practice, it wasn't really doing much for the European Union. If you can just go on to the next slide, please, Simon. And there was lots of things happening. There was been calls for years for this practice to stop in the UK. And one of the reasons that we couldn't is because we were a member of the EU and we had freedom of trade of goods. So it was actually really difficult for the UK government to do anything about banning the practice of live exports and imports. And just a couple of examples there. In September 2012, there was a vehicle transporting more than 500 live sheep through Ramsgate, and they were declared unfit to travel, and they had to be removed. And quite a lot of those sheep died, which is absolutely horrific and just unnecessary. And then a more recent example was 1,500 sheep that drowned where a boat capsized. And obviously sheep were trapped, and sheep can't swim, so unfortunately they drowned, and this caused quite a lot of uproar, these instances in the UK, and there was fresh calls for this practice to be banned. Next slide, please, Simon. So really, since Brexit, the UK has kind of run with this. So they then had the freedom to ban live exports of farmed animals for fattening or slaughter, and they've done this under the Animal Welfare Livestock Exports Act of 2024. So there is still some live transport allowed for other reasons, but it's very, very strict. There's very strict requirements attached to that. But generally, we have now banned that practice in the UK. The EU hasn't yet introduced such a ban. There's been continuing calls for them to do so, and they have been discussing the idea, but it's been very, very slow for that to come in. And I think the important thing to note there is that if we had still been a member of the EU, we probably wouldn't have been able to introduce this ban until the EU had made the moves to do this. So this could, one of the impacts of Brexit arguably could be we can lead to better protection in the UK. Next slide, please, Simon. So, overall, concluding thoughts on the EU then. So, with the EU, obviously, Simon said it was brought in for trade, trade, trade. That was the initial purpose of the EU. But then we had, all of these kind of trading blocks and restrictions on our freedoms when it did come to trade. So, really, we're thinking there when we're thinking of the DNA of the European Union and how that relates to animal protection, it's not really the setup that we wanted. as we've kind of highlighted throughout, positive changes made by the EU could be more strongly felt in other EU member states, particularly when we're thinking about things like sentience and animal experimentation as the examples that we gave. But as Simon's put on the slide, there's a bit of a north-south divide there, and some countries really take up the opportunities and others don't. And there's still quite a few issues that remain. So Simon's put some links there of the EU group for animals and the animal welfare into European group as well, to have a look at some of the work that they've been doing around this and the calls for change that they're making within the EU. But the EU has quite bold statements. So there's a big failure to implement a lot of the things that they say that they're going to promise. So the 1977 protocol on animal sentience, that's been happening, that's been around for quite a long time, but they haven't banned fur farming. That's something that's been discussed a lot, but hasn't seemed to come in. In some EU countries, that's still quite a big practice. So we do have quite a lot of issues with that. And the discrepancy between public opinion and legislative control, there's a lot of calls for the public to ban certain practices, or they want certain change within the EU. But that hasn't really come across when we look at the policies and the legislation. But I suppose one of the issues on that Simon's highlighted on the slides is that would the public pay more? So a lot of those changes mean that a lot of the prices of our goods would go up, and would the public be happy with that as well? So there's that balancing of the welfare needs, and whilst I know where I would like it to be balanced, that might not be something that is popular in public opinion. Simon.
Unmute. Okay, just to summarise then. Oh, what happened? I lost the slide there. This looks at where next for the European Union. The European Commission, just to show what the state of the European Union, I think at the moment, they've called for evidence on literally this year, in June 2025, to look at outdated animal welfare legislation. They've been threatening this since about 2014 to look at all law again. But when they put forward the plan, when the Commission put forward the timetable of discussions of what was going to be on at the table, it wasn't in there. And that's 21st of October, that's a few days ago. So they promised one thing with one hand, taken away with the other one. And the EU is living with animal welfare legislation, which has not been revised for over 20 years now. So it needs work. In the UK, it could be argued that the UK has realised some of its freedoms now they've left the EU. There's been relatively fast change. I think, we look at transport of animals, and you look at the idea of the Brexit leading to the Sentience Committee. That's been quite a considerable benefit. Still lots of setbacks and restrictions, though, and some things the government has promised recently seem to have fallen off the agenda, but we don't quite have time to discuss that now. So, summary. Title of this talk was about DNA. Certainly, the DNA of the EU was originally to stop World War III and to tie everybody in economically. The economic level playing field is fundamental to this, and a lot of animal welfare protection was brought in to create the level playing field so that those giving high welfare to animals wouldn't necessarily be disadvantaged against those countries that had low priorities for animal welfare. And that broadly speaking has been a success of the European Union, no doubt about it. Public opinion is vital, but people say, there's been lots of big studies across the EU, and people say they consider this to be high priority, but then would you pay more for meat produced better? Then they say less favourable things about that. And again, it just brings it back to, this has not been done on the basis of the philosophy and the ethics of dealing with animals in the right kind of way. It's been done on the basis of markets and keeping the markets going. The EU is all about the markets, and that's what it keeps going. So there is a bit of a change in the air, though. 2023, the European Parliament talked about better information for consumers for animal welfare. That appears to be about labelling and following the science. Now, that is a big change. Rather than seeing this as an economic market to be dealt with, then they're talking about the science, and science, as probably a lot of you know, points in the direction of animals needing certain things to protect their welfare, their sentience. And to talk about that, the evidence, then surely the evidence is going to reveal that they need to change their laws at a much more philosophical level. We shall see. So it could, the point of hope is the EU's economic DNA being changed by scientific evidence and philosophy, very possibly. And
our book. So we did a thing. We wrote a book. So Debbie Rook and I jumped on Simon and Debbie Legg's. Well, it was originally updating of the previous book, but then it became something a little bit different. So yeah, this is a big examination of the laws relating to animals in the UK, but we do consider European and international law as well, and it's quite socio-legal in its approach also. And not to judge a book by one, but it does have a very pretty front cover as well. So hopefully some of you engage with that new book that we just brought out this year.
it was a lot of fun writing it.
It
Hard work,
was.
but yes, a lot of the issues and the way we look at the law is, in terms of the way we've looked at it today, that it's all about how do you challenge, how do you change. There's the philosophical questions being asked, etc., not just practicality. So there we go. And our octopus is now asking, do you have any questions or points for discussion?
Yeah. Charlotte's put something interesting in the chat about, the research with the UK consumers saying they would pay more for higher welfare products, which is, very true, Charlotte, but some of the research from the EU generally shows the opposite. So maybe, again, it's just a bit of a difference between the UK and the EU generally, but I think I need to dig a little bit deeper down into the data for that comparison.
I would be interested to know, certainly from US people who are here now, how this compares, what you've heard compares with what you have in the US on any of these subjects. Anybody have any comments? That would be good. Or questions?
I guess I'll start. You said that you were originally going to update the book and then it became its own thing. What are some of the big changes that made you realize that it was becoming its own thing? What are some of the things you realized?
Do you want to? You go first, Rachel. Go on.
No, I think you should, Simon, because you wrote the original one was it in the 90s?
Debbie Legg and I had written in the 1990s, so that the research included a lot of the 1970s work, Singer, Reagan, just as the basis of what animal rights, what was it, interests, etc. And since then, since 1997, we've had a huge explosion in the work of Stephen Wise, as you'll know, and David Faber, in terms of a different way of looking at animals and as a separate entity of property. There's been such a lot of development in terms of the way that the philosophy and ethics works in analysing all these areas. It all had to be rewritten, let alone the actual substantive changes to the law. There's a lot more protection, a lot more has happened, probably at domestic level rather than EU level, to change for animals. And it was a big task, and we talked about it, I think, at conferences. The UK has started some big conferences recently. We held, I think it was the first one, animal law and ethics conference at John Moores University in 2017, then a second one in 2019. And there was about 150 people there, and I was only expecting about 20. And it was clear that this has become a much bigger issue, and there was a lot of people interested in it from all sorts of perspectives. And when we were talking about it, Debbie Legg and I, we thought we need to get some of these experts in. It's why Rachel came in, and why Debbie Rook came in as well. And it made it a much broader project overall. And it's a big project. It take us 5 years to basically completely rewrite what was only a couple of chapters survive in anything like the original form. But the other 6 or 7 are completely new and different, a different approach.
One of the big things in the US is we have a lot of corporate interests, factory farms, and all that. Do you have similar in Europe? And how are they as powerful of a lobbying interest as in the US? Or are we just
Yeah. Yeah, most of the meat in the UK comes from intensive farms. So the majority of the meat that we see on our shelves in supermarkets has come from these big intensive farms. Um, yes, they do have quite a lot of lobbying power. There's been some recent challenges to some practices, especially with Franken chickens, so fast-growing chickens. The Humane League brought a challenge to the government. On allowing that practice to happen because of the welfare issues, stating that it contravenes animal welfare legislation, and then other issues to do with kind of trigger points for reporting and things like that. And it just never gets through. And it's because it's such a massive economic part of our country, right? So if the courts were suddenly to go, well, this is what I think, if the courts were suddenly to go, right, okay, yep, that's an illegal practice, you shouldn't be doing that, that's going to have a massive hit on that industry. So I think they basically just want to leave it to Parliament, but Parliament aren't going to touch that because they're very up on food security at the moment. So it's a bit of a mess, really. But the latest case from the Humane League, one of the worrying things about that is it kind of moved a little bit further in a way towards the US model of it's kind of industry led. So if it's a common industry practice, then that's the way it is, kind of thing. So that was one of the worrying things to come out of that, of basically the judge saying farmers know the welfare standards and they can set them for these chickens. So yeah, it's they do have a lot of influence, even if it's not necessarily kind of publicly announced influence. I think they do.
a question from online? On a practical level, is there enforcement? And if not, who has standing to enforce via the courts?
Wow.
Mm,
Yeah, it's a mess.
mm.
I think we can
It's
say.
it's one of the issues we look at in the book, actually. That one of the themes, it's called challenges and themes. And one of the big themes that came out right across the board was the problems with enforcement. If you look in the EU, the enforcement is pretty thin. If you look at wild law, wild animals and wild law, there is enforcement, but these bodies are small, they're underfunded, they don't have the reach, and you're talking about major international crime. It's a big problem. At UK level, prosecutions are very rarely picked up by the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, which is the body with the main um, everything behind it to be able to prosecute. And they're taken up by the RSPCA, and the governments have sort of deferred all kind of animal welfare issues to the RSPCA, and that's a charity. So you wonder whether it's always taken as seriously as it can be. So enforcement is a massive issue, limited
Mhm.
resources. I don't know whether the call would fall on deaf ears, to be honest, at the moment.
Yeah, I think actually the best report that the Animal Sentience Committee has done so far has been on enforcement in the UK. And they really
Mm,
highlight how there's so many different bodies involved. They're all really underfunded. They all have different kind of levels of powers. But yeah, and the struggles that they face. So definitely, there is a link. So we do have two reference slides after this one. There's a
mm,
link to the Animal Sentience Committee's report. So if you're interested further, definitely take a look at that.
mm,
In 2024, the Australian government announced a ban on live sheep exports commencing May 2028. Through the Commonwealth's ideas for the future, though the Commonwealth's ideas for the future included increasing domestic sheep. Sorry, let's start over. In 2024, the Australian government announced a ban on live sheep exports commencing in May 2028. Though the Commonwealth's ideas for the future included increasing domestic sheep meat processing capacity. Can you comment on this issue in the UK context and the possible ban on live export?
Yeah. Um, yeah, so we have now banned it in the UK. seemingly relatively easily in a way, wasn't it, Simon? It kind of
Yeah.
went through without much opposition, and it seems to have just been like, okay, that's the way it's gone, and people have just kind of got on board of it. As far as I'm aware, I haven't heard any particular issues with the ban since it's come in.
It seems like the Australian government there, that's, if I'm reading this right, they've increased domestic sheep meat processing capacity. So I don't know whether that's to just more Australians are eating more meat, or it's that means that they're going to export that meat. Seems to be, well, that's been argued for a long time. Why not? We know why they were doing this, because it was very costly to freeze meat and transport it across Europe. In our case, I expect the geographical challenges are even greater over in Australia. So you transport the animals live and then slaughter when you get to the other end. It was all about costs, but it seems now that's gone. And I think that was the call that if there is to be meat production, and speaking as a vegan, difficult subject to completely understand, but if there is to be meat production, surely the slaughter has to be as close as possible to where those animals are actually brought up. There's no excuse for it at all in terms of taking animals. We know it's a problem. If you drive along the motorways of Britain right now, you can see those animals being transported to up and down the country, let alone into other countries. And that still happens. A journey from, even though it's a relatively small country, a journey from the north of England down to the south coast or Devon or wherever these animals are being taken to market is a considerable journey, and I think it's still a problem at the local level, personally.
Yeah. Yeah, one interesting country I think to keep an eye on is Brazil. I haven't checked on this actually lately, in the last few months, but they had an interesting case going through their court system that effectively banned it. And there was kind of opposition to that, but the judgment was really lovely about wanting to ban the practice of it. So that I think that's an interesting country to keep an eye on as well in terms of live
To make a
export.
comment actually on one of these other comments, somebody mentioned about who has standing. I think one point of interest in relation to standing is that we haven't had a similar progress in terms of court cases related to animal welfare in this country. We haven't had the history of it. And I know that the Stephen Wise project, that seems to be its whole core is to get questions of standing into courts. Well, we didn't have that in the UK, but there are certain lawyers now turning their minds to doing that, and one is advocates for animals, Edie Bowles and co, who are taking issues of standing and representing charities, animal welfare charities in court when they have certain issues, and because obviously the legal expertise has not been there before, and it is now, and that's making a big difference. They're getting a lot of cases and a lot of joy taking local authorities to court, and whether they're doing the right things in relation to transport, etc. So that is an interesting development the last 5 or 6 years, I would say, in the UK. And I think Karen Courtine, who I know, hello Karen, was making a comment about victimology, a call for arguing cases being brought for animals being victims of crime. That has been mentioned historically, actually, a lot. That why is because animals are considered to be property. If you assault a dog, then it's the owner who gets all the benefits of the money, and none of that's gone to the animal itself, although it might do should the owner consider it necessary. But yeah, that has been talked about, and that is, I think, I think it'd be right in saying, maybe Rachel would comment on this as well, that the state of the law is still such that the property angle on animals is pretty overwhelming at the moment. And any challenge to that in terms of taking resources and giving that to animals would be quite difficult. I don't think the courts are prepared to do that at the moment. But the natural extension of animals having rights might be that is the case, and and to treat them as victims.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the amazing things in the US that we're not getting in the UK. You seem to have these much more philosophical debates through the courtroom of should animals be legal persons, etc. I just can't see that happening in the UK anytime soon. Our courts seem to just be much more conservative to conversations around that. You can see acknowledgements that animals aren't just property in some cases, particularly in pet custody cases, but really it's just not as developed as it is. So we really enjoy watching your case law develop on those subjects.
Got another comment here. Two big differences than the US is ag-gag legislation,
Mm,
the use of growth hormones in farm animals. Wonder how much the government grants and subsidies come into play in Europe.
mm. Um, a little bit.
I think that you could say, I don't know about, I know it is a big problem in the US. So I've seen that. In in Europe, I think it's different. And well, probably the same thing happening in a different way because the farming lobby in the EU is extremely strong. French farmers are known particularly for having a penchant of taking manure and dumping it in the streets of Paris to make a point, or wherever the EU is sitting at that time, and Brussels, and they have managed to create a system of subsidies in the EU, which has lasted ever since its inception. Now, there's a lot of money goes into farming. The greatest majority of EU funding goes into farming. It's a very powerful lobby. So with that lobby, if there was a challenge to really take these issues of farming animals down to its basic level and to maybe stop it, as would be the ultimate argument, I would argue, I think there would be a lot of resistance to
Mhm,
that. I think that's a long way away,
mhm,
and the EU just mentioning the fact that we may have to change our legislation, it seems to be about as far as they're able to get at the moment. So whether the political will is there, I do not know.
mhm. Yeah.
What
How do we get the
would
new book? Well, that's an easy one. Sorry, can answer that one. The five it's 5M Publishing. If anybody is interested in picking it up, I think there's if you go onto my LinkedIn page, there is a 20% off voucher as well somewhere floating around, and I think it's still in operation. You could give it a try if you're going to. Right, thank you very much for considering us. As
uh,
the
I,
emoji goes, yes, Brett.
what would you like to see in what would you like to see and think might be attainable in the next 5 years legislatively?
In the UK.
Yes.
Hmm. Oh,
Can I
what
have
a
a go
wish.
first?
Yeah.
It's a big question. That I would like to see. I'd like to see some of the issues that have been rolling around for quite some time to be
Mhm,
challenged. I think there's a big problem with pets at the moment. With that they're not covered. That there seem to be pet farms springing up all across Ireland to deal with a domestic market that doesn't seem to be regulated anywhere
mhm,
near as closely as it could be. And I think it's become insidious. It's really become quite big, quite worryingly quickly. And I think that that would be at a small level. I think some progress on those kind of issues where people are definitely getting around the law, and horses as well. Bad treatment of horses. I think these are in this day and age absolutely incredible. But I think some recognition of the work of the Sentience Committee in England. There's another one in Scotland, well, the Sentience Commission. They've got a commission up there that to see how these work. Because if they really do work, then I think the scientific definitions of sentience are going to come to the fore more often. And that might change hearts and minds, and I think that's what is needed, because to wean people off the whole idea of this massive market for meat production and the waste is which I think is crucial to all these arguments to a certain extent, is going to be a significant task. There has been progress, but I think for them to work through governments to ministers to be able to put things in place which stop things happening rather than just regulate them and make a little bit better would be, for me, progress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think for me, I think it's linked to that, Simon, but maybe a bit broader and less realistic, is I think I would just like to see proper recognition from governments that non-human animal issues are human issues. It's not that it's a separate thing to us. You know, issues that impact animals can have an impact on us as well. And that seems to get lost somewhere. It's very much an us and them. Um, and again, the US and parts of the US are much better at this than we are. So, for example, domestic abuse laws in the US, in some states, animals can be included in, a domestic abuse order, and they're removed from the home as well at the same time as the survivor of domestic abuse. We don't have anything like that in England. So there's a big issue with pets being left in homes, because, survivors can't take them with them, or basically staying in the home and subjecting themselves to further abuse because they don't want to leave their companion animal. And the government could easily fix that. And yes, it would take money and resource, but they just don't seem to see that link of, we could make this a better process for a lot of people and help further solve issues with domestic abuse, which is a really big thing at the moment as well in the UK. If we also help solve this animal issue, which is beneficial for the animals as well. So I just feel like sometimes we just have this disconnect where we don't often think of us as a one world approach, a one system approach when it comes to animal and human issues. But I think that is more of a systemic change that is going to be much harder to come through. So if anyone can make that happen, that would be great. Thank you.
Just a comment from Karen Courtine, who says that she managed to get the book on inspection copy. Worth a try.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, unless you have any final comments, I want to thank you again for doing this. This was a great talk. Thank you everyone for attending. I will be sending out the slides, a link to the book, and a link to the video, probably early next week. So again, thank you everyone so much for doing this, and this has been a great semester. Hope to see you in 2026.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for all the interesting questions
Thank
and
you.
comments. Thank you, and thank you for inviting us.
Well, thank you. All right. Have a good one, everyone.